Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single episode and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Ron Granieri, professor of history at the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College and podcast editor of the War Room. It's a pleasure to have you with us. In setting his priorities for the future of the force, the Army Chief of Staff, General Randy George, has called for enhancing and sustaining an Army-wide culture of warfighting and has challenged the Army to think more concretely about that culture and how to nurture it. The Army War College has responded to that challenge. Members of the class of 2024 in the Carlisle Scholars Program have participated in an integrated research project on enhancing and sustaining a culture of warfighting and have produced a white paper on the subject. Carlisle Scholars are a subset of the resident program here at the Army War College that combines a self-taught approach to the standard curriculum with client-based research projects like this one. Today, on A Better Peace, we welcome 3 Carlisle Scholars to discuss the Culture of Warfighting project and their contributions to it. And those 3 Carlisle Scholars are first, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Henderson, who is an active duty infantry officer having commissioned in 2001 from Boise State University, where he earned a BA in history. In 2014, he earned an MA in military studies from American Military University. And Lieutenant Colonel Henderson has held leadership positions from platoon leader to battalion commander. We also have Pamela Lovasz, is an Army civilian and a professional engineer and geologist. Prior to coming to the Army War College, she worked for the Army Corps of Engineers in Los Angeles. She has served in leadership positions as an Army civilian, managing and supervising up to 200 employees as a division chief. And after she graduates from the War College, she is heading to New York City, where she will serve the Army Corps of Engineers New York District. Finally, Lieutenant Colonel Rick Luce has a diverse military background with armor, mechanized infantry, airborne, light, and motorized assignments. He also did a 4-year tour in the asymmetric warfare group. His battalion command was particularly unique as he led a Republic of Korea U.S. light infantry battalion in the Joint Security Area, which is the DMZ of North and South Korea in Panmunjom. Lieutenant Colonel Luce has served in 4 combat tours, 1 in Iraq and 3 in Afghanistan. He's also conducted numerous overseas assignments in the Pacific, Israel, and North Africa. 3 very qualified and very well-traveled people who are here to talk about their work as students in the Carlisle Scholars Program at the Army War College. Welcome to A Better Peace, colleagues.
Ooh, thank you. Thank you for having us.
That's great to be here.
So as part of the integrated research project, each of you was responsible for writing at least one information paper that then became part of the larger white paper for the Chief of Staff. I wanted to give each of you a chance to summarize your info paper to get us started about the sorts of things that go into this discussion of cultural warfighting. And I'm going to ask you to do that in the order that I introduced you. So I'm going to start with you, Ike Henderson, please.
Okay, yeah, thanks for having us. My portion of the paper was talking about shoot, move, and communicate. Is a common term that we use in combat arms. It's a term that originated back in the early 80s. And it was more to get out of the mindset of the combat arms to how every soldier can see themselves as a warfighter. Shoot, move, and communicate. To me and Rick has a certain understanding. I need to know how to engage targets. I got to know how to maneuver my elements on the battlefield. And I got to know how to communicate to them up, down, to my left and right. But to a cook or a finance officer, shoot, move, and communicate may be used totally different. Mm-hmm. So that was my portion of the paper, just to demonstrate how that term can be used in a combat sense, but yet use it in a sense that most soldiers don't necessarily go to the range or get the maneuver opportunities as a combat arms officer or a soldier.
Makes a lot of sense, right? Before you can do something, you have to name it, or at least while you're doing it.
Yep. And how does that relate to your job set? Substituting going to the range. Use the same concept.
All right. Thanks, Ike.
Nope.
So, Pam, how about you? What was your info paper?
Yeah, so I represent the Army civilian, and the motivation for jumping on this particular project was to bring that diverse background. So I really appreciate Tom Galvin jumping on the opportunity to be able to potentially be heard by the Chief of Staff of the current Army. Sure. And my motivation for the paper was from the last two positions I've held as a Chief of Engineering Division. And the workforce that I was responsible for was spread very thin. They were overworked. They were looking to deliver engineering products and services to keep up with schedules and things like that. And what I found was that it was a bit of a distracted workforce. And my paper speaks to not necessarily specific solutions, but that a leader of these types of organizations should have an awareness of what types of distractions are out there for the workforce that keeps them from focusing on core missions.
Gotcha. Very good. Thanks, Pam. Rick, how about you? What was your info paper on?
So great discussion between Pam and Ike, and mine were similar, and I actually did two. So the first one I did was on Inspector General and Equal Opportunity Complaint System Abuse. And some of the terms that we introduced in that have been kind of talked about in the military, but we wanted to bring them to forefront. So that's like a toxic subordinate or a toxic followership. And we also brought into use an investigative culture. And really what this has done, it's been an erosion of the principles of mission command, which are so beneficial, specifically competence, mutual trust, and risk acceptance. And what my perception is, and many of the leaders that I've talked with, is it's really kind of become a guilty until proven innocent. And so certain followers or leaders can weaponize a system that was designed to protect them and also the leaders. And then, we just assessed that this, the Army's response to it has been inadequate. And so, we laid out a few things that we think can really get after that. And we see this as a barrier to the culture of warfighting. The second white paper that I did was on administrative complexity and then issues with rules of engagement. And so this really covers two topics: micromanagement across the system, and then administrative complexity as being a barrier to culture of warfighting. For example, in the Afghan CONOP process, my 3 tours over there, every year the restrictions and the approval process got larger and larger. So by the end of it, just for a platoon to do a regular ambush patrol, something that a company commander should be able to manage, required a general officer approval. So that centralization now will be devastating to us in large-scale combat operations. And I think because of that, we've embraced the micromanagement culture that's focused on control, obsession with details, and then a discomfort with delegation and decentralization, which are going to be critical. And then I think when we talk about the administrative requirements, the amount of things that officers and leaders have to do to train, equip, acquire materials, even traveling and using your city card, there are so many layers now, and those distract from commanders doing what their real job is, which is get ready for combat.
Right. Of all three of the papers, they were this issue of how do we identify what we're doing, and how do we actually make sure that people are doing their job, they're not doing the things that are supposed to be preparing them to do their job. There's a lot of different directions to go in on this. And Pam, I'm glad you mentioned Dr. Tom Galvin, who is the Spiritus Rector behind this project, one of the faculty leaders of Carlisle Scholars, also familiar to regular listeners of this podcast, because Dr. Galvin has been on several War Room podcasts over the years. On a very basic level, what does it mean to you individually and collectively, if you came up with an answer? What does a culture of warfighting actually mean? What does it mean to have a culture of warfighting? Pam, can I ask you first?
That's a great question, because one of the first meetings that we had as a team, we were asking the same thing. What does it mean? What does it mean to be a warfighter? Because a warfighter can look like your combat arms, which we have in the room, Ike and Rick, but support of the warfighter can come from people like civilians, like myself. And for me personally, what that means is that we understand collectively, no matter what your job is, if you're working for the Department of Defense or the Army, that you know that your role is bare bones, in my opinion, to support the warfighter. Whether it's a force management job or a cook or someone that's designing an army barrack overseas or a school or something like that. It is to have that mindset that you are in a position of support for the warfighter. The warfighter probably needs to be defined because it can look in many different forms.
Right.
It can be intel, it can be combat arms, it could be a number of things. It could be attorneys that work for the Army.
Sure.
And so it could be civilians. And so that was one of our sources of topics at the very beginning. And we moved out with this project with that understanding.
One of my favorite cliches is David Foster Wallace talked about two fish are swimming in the water, and one fish asks the other one, "So have you ever thought about what water is?" And the other one says, "Well, what's water?" Right? Because when you're in it, right, you don't define it at all. And so I'm going to look at you, Ike and Rick, right? I suppose you didn't have to spend a lot of time when you were a platoon leader asking everybody what's it mean to be a warfighter, especially if you're in Afghanistan or in Iraq. But what has the process of trying to answer that question meant for you? So if you do it and now you have to define it.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with you, Ike, and then to you, Rick.
I think Pam hit it on the dot because our first meeting was, I would argue our first 2 or 3 meetings was, what is a war fighter? We looked up the Webster definition of warfighter, but the Army does not have a definition that defines warfighter.
Interesting.
And and I can probably speak for Rick when we said warfighter. Hey, we know what that means. Hey, you out there in the field, you shoot, move, all those things. But over time, as we start doing this project, to me, I kind of looked at the term, the culture of warfighting is everything that the Army is doing to prep us for future combat. I think is ingrained in the combat arms mindset of that. Everything I do, whether it's in garrison, whether it's in the field, is prepping me for combat.
Rick, how about you? What's your, especially because you have this experience, as we've talked about, multiple different kinds of units. You've also done, as you mentioned before we started recording, right, that you've been in the Guard. You actually took some time off from the Army and came back. What is your sense of what it has meant for you to be a warfighter and part of this culture of warfighting?
Well, I think Ike and Pam were spot on, and absolutely, our first 3 or 4 meetings really were trying to define it. And I think the issue is not defining it for, as Ike said, the warfighter. Your combat arms, your rangers, infantry, armor, combat engineers, folks who are actually designed to go and close with and destroy the enemy. Warfighting, I think, is like swimming in water, as you said. But from my understanding, of course, as I've grown as a leader, knowing how important the enterprise is behind the warfighter, I think, is what we were trying to get after. And when the chief talked about his 4 priorities, so warfighting was number 1, delivering combat-ready formation number 2, exercising continuous transformation, and then strengthening the profession. Those were his. But if you look at the actual background of all those, it has nothing to do with the Ranger or the airborne. It's the enterprise, it's the system, it's the senior staff, the commands, the personnel systems, how we acquire materials. So I think the chief's getting after, and what we try to do here is, 1, come up with what are those barriers to doing that, but then how do we have a mindset change across the enterprise? So much like I'll go back to World War II, whether you were turning wrenches and building B-2s or building tanks, or whether you were on the front lines or whether you were cooking, everyone was focused on a common mission and they knew they were contributing, regardless of what they were actually doing, and they were all important. I think we've lost that because we've allowed the last 20 years where our warfighters have been combat focused forward, but the enterprise behind them is atrophied because we haven't required it. And so I think the chief's spot on, but I think it requires a mindset shift from across the enterprise, not just the soldiers and airmen and sailors.
Right, because that's warfighters aren't just trigger pullers, right?
Correct.
And I think that would be the biggest part, is what Rick said, that transformation, not transformation like in what we going through, modernization, transformation of the Army. I think it's a mindset transformation for not just senior leaders, but leaders at every echelon to understand that, hey, it's not just a combat arm mindset that everybody have to contribute to this culture of warfighting to get after what the chief is trying to install into the force today.
Right. Well, and so Rick, you brought this up, but also I want to turn to you, Pam, again. So you and I are both Department of the Army civilians, and so the sense of what practical and intellectual barriers do you think exist that keep the civilians from understanding themselves as part of a culture of warfighting, but also that make it difficult for the uniformed service members and the civilians to see each other as part of the same enterprise? And how can we break down those barriers?
Sure. I think at the workplace, you can get enthralled in your day-to-day activity and somehow forget that the core mission is supporting the warfighter.
Right.
At the Army Corps of Engineers, we have several missions, but our two main ones are civil works, which are dams, levees, flood fight, and we have military construction, both missions being of equal importance. I have experience in both. When I work on the military construction projects, for example, I held a position over in South Korea as well. One of our largest projects was the relocation of Camp Humphreys, which was an $11 billion massive relocation over in South Korea.
For sure.
When you're working on projects like that, fundamentally you understand, I am here to support the warfighter. It's very easy to see. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes when you're working on other types of projects, you can get into the day-to-day and forget. So I would say ultimately taking on some of these assignments, especially leadership. I'm here at the Army War College as a civilian, and this has really opened up my eyes to what everybody does. I have a new appreciation for example, combat arms and what they do and how we all fit in.
Rick, when you were over in Korea, was that before, after, or during this big move of Camp Humphreys?
So it was after. So I was there from 20 to 2022. Camp Humphreys was set up. They mostly closed down the Yongsan base, so there was very few people there. And then all the northern bases were closed down other than Camp Casey and then Camp Boniface. So yeah, it was a big project. Driving down there, I was like, oh wow, I just went back to Fort Hood or Cavazos. I mean, that was the size and scope of it. And I know it was years in the undertaking. When I was with the Asymmetric Warfare Group, I was there between 2013 and 2015, and they were building it at the time, and it was a huge focus for the leadership.
I believe it. So Rick, I want to come back to you because also one of the interesting things in your paper on the issue of rules of engagement and combat decisions, and I'm trying to think as a larger issue, because this also relates to Pam's question about sort of training responsibilities and the kinds of things that distract you from the job that you're trying to do, is how can mission command coexist with formalized rules of engagement, right? We pride ourselves by thinking that what makes the United States military different from our adversaries is we believe in mission command, we give responsibility and allow initiative in the hands of commanders closer to the fight. How can we do that while also, let's say, respecting the value of rules of engagement? Especially because I'm trying to think about you when you were working on in the joint security area, right? This sounds to me like a place where, on the one hand, right, you're literally on the knife's edge of a major world conflict, right, on the dividing line, but also totally shot through with all kinds of very detailed protocol arrangements about how you handle the DMZ. And so, how should we think about training everybody down to platoon leader to handle mission command when we know that there are people all the way back at the very, all the way back in the building who are trying to think about how we're supposed to control this or keep things from getting out of hand?
No, you bring up some great points, and both General Abrams and General LeCamera, who were the senior commanders for this battalion, said the same thing. You're a tactical level formation doing combat patrols in the DMZ every day, but you have strategic impacts on what decisions you make. So I think I'm not saying that rules of engagement aren't important or not having strict requirements on what you can and cannot do. Those are important, especially up in the JSA. You know, for example, we would have to be engaged by a North Korean patrol or have them come south of the actual DMZ before we can engage them. Where in the past, the North Koreans would just shoot at us randomly or put bombs, stuff like that. So there were some very strict limits, but we taught our soldiers about, you know, what defense was and then where your limits were. We made sure that we did the right process so they understood where the actual boundary was so we didn't cross or do things like that. I think two things come to mind. So that's one operational environment. And then over the last 20 years in our global war on terrorism, we had another operational environment that started off more large-scale combat operations, but then turned into that stability operations with stringent ROE, where the civilian population was the most important thing, trying to win the heart and mind stuff. And I think that mindset has been inculcated through us now when we're looking at a large-scale combat operation like we'd have in World War II. Those rules of engagement and those strict, like civilians are paramount. I'm not saying the civilian life's not important. You know, we do fight with our ethics and our morals, but understanding what your purpose is. So if it's destruction of another enemy's force or breaking their will to do war, then those bring in different requirements and different rule sets, and we have to be open to that and not so centralized and dictated that we can't accomplish what we want to.
Sure, because I think about this, all the jokes about strategic corporals, right? You know, a 19-year-old on patrol can have enormous impact on the future of the United States and the future of the world, depending on where that patrol happens to take place and how comfortable / nervous / sort of how well trained that corporal could be. And so I think about that kind of pressure. And I want to go to Pam. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Rick was saying about the training. And I would say that don't discredit that the majority of training is going to happen on the job. Mm-hmm. What you just described was on the job training at its finest, right?
Sure.
Or at its worst, however you want to look at it. The classroom training makes up a very small percentage. And so I think that as leaders, we can emphasize both, because they're both there as a resource for us.
Both there as a resource. No, I get that. And when I was looking at your bio, and for a guy who commissioned into the United States Army in 2001, I don't think people have to look too far back to realize around 2001, the United States Army got really busy and stayed busy for a long time. And so, what was it like when you were initially commissioned, when you were Lieutenant Henderson? Where did the Army send you, and what did you end up doing?
Yeah, I was working prior to my after I got commissioned, because we had a break in between going to the basic course, and I was literally watching the towers, the airplane flying to the tower at work. Mm-hmm. And everybody was like, "Oh, we going to war? We going?" I said, "Oh, well, I don't know if we are." And then, we did. And when I got to Fort Benning, did my time there, and then my first duty station was at 10th Mountain up in New York, Fort Drum. Mm-hmm. And 3 months later, I was finding myself in Afghanistan. At that time, we was just doing 6 months deployments, and then got back 2003. Iraq kicked off, and then 2004 found myself in Iraq. So like Rick, multiple deployments. It's our whole generation, our whole time, the past 20 years, been in combat. Yeah. Different from what our brothers and sisters experienced during World War II, similar to Vietnam, but different. But still those same kind of traits, those same kind of problem sets that we had to deal with. Being a young man at the time, the Army can train you, but it cannot train you for some of the things that we experienced over there. So I think the training that we did receive kind of put you in a place to be successful. Mm-hmm. But everybody that went over there, I honestly believe, came back with a level of PTSD. Some know how to manage it better than others, but you can't go through something like that and not come back the same as you went.
And this kind of experience does change you, right?
Yes.
One hopes it makes we hope it makes you stronger. Hope it makes you makes you deeper in a lot of ways, but it definitely changes.
And it gives you a respect for being American.
See, and this is good. And Rick, I want to turn to you on this as well. Right? The idea of for you in particular, for people here at the War College who are at the cusp of strategic leadership, right? Is how do we communicate, especially if we're in the midst of a transition, we're potentially in the midst of transition from the global war on terror to great power competition. We're thinking about different kinds of fighting in different kinds of places. We may hope I guess this table is wood. We may hope that we won't be engaged in a fight anytime soon. We may go through a period where there will be a gap between people who are fighting and not fighting. How do you see your responsibility, especially when dealing with younger officers, to talk about what you experienced and how they should think about getting themselves ready for what might be different fights in the future? Right? How do we manage that kind of dialogue about getting people to think about the roles that you have played and that they are likely to play?
Well, I think there's a couple things. So when you talk to younger leaders, a lot of them have not deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq. They don't have combat patches anymore, so that's getting more common. But I think we also have to look that when we're talking about large-scale combat operations, what we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine, Iran, Hamas, that some of the lessons we learned during that global war on terrorism actually were not the right lessons, and that we built a force and a mindset designed for a specific purpose versus focusing on the fundamentals of war fighting. And I think, so when I talk to other young officers, it's about being competent in their job, understanding whatever that is. So whether you're a finance clerk or whether you're an Army Ranger or whether you're an armor, it doesn't matter. There are certain competencies and things that you need to be good at, and you must be good at those. And then the human dimension is always part of it. So how people think about it, the cognitive side. And I think for young officers, really it's about being prepared to go to war and to win. And for me, as getting on that cusp, like you said, of being a strategic leader, what I want to get to is where the advisors to our policymakers and our civilians and our senior leaders are ones that we set up for success for our combat formations if they do, so that we don't have an Afghanistan pullout and we don't have the PTSD that I talked about. Because a lot of that goes back to doing things for 20 years with a set of motivations and a purpose, and then not accomplishing those, much like you go back to Vietnam. That's a hard pill to swallow. And it was the same when I was up in the JSA, as I learned the history of the Korean War and then how we ended that, and then looking at the Kaesong Heights and being like, oh, there's all these North Korean field artillery that put Seoul at risk, knowing that we held those heights and that we gave it up during negotiations. Those type of things are really hard to swallow. So for me, it's about helping them be focused on what your job is at this moment, focusing on that, and then understanding the bigger context. And that's what makes this so challenging.
Sure. Well, and with that in mind, for the three of you, right, your experience, I'm curious about your experience at the War College, and especially in Carlisle Scholars, right? So you're here, you bring your experience with you to this place, and then we tell you the first day you show up that what got you here isn't going to get you where you're going to go next. And so somehow this year here, the 10 months here at the War College is supposed to prepare you for what comes next. And I am curious about how you feel this experience has worked for you, what you think about the War College and the Carlisle Scholars Program. I'm looking at you, Pam. I'll let you go first. What do you think?
Sure. So it's been a great experience, and I'm not going to lie though, there's been a lot of stress, a lot of homework and reading and things like that, but all very, very good. I learned, like I said, about what other jobs are in the Army. Also, within our Carlisle Scholars Program, similar to other seminars, we have a diverse group of students. We have Air Force, Navy, international fellows, combat arms, Army civilians, and just learning from each other what other people do. That's been very enlightening to me.
Oh, I believe it. Mike, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with what Pam said. I think the biggest thing for me was the theories, the classes that we had with Professor Tino, and just it opened my mind to. I went places that I'd never been before because I never thought like that. Kind of like what Rick was talking about. For the past 20 years, we've been fighting, got a total of 6 deployments. So you come home, come back, go home. You didn't have time to sit down and kind of think the way we thought in this course. And to add on to that with our international students that we have in the class, I learned so much about NATO that I didn't even know. I mean, it's U.S. has a big role in NATO, but just the way they talk about NATO compared to how we talk about NATO was really fascinating to me. So the course was phenomenal.
Great. Rick, how about you?
Yeah, just like Pam and Ike said, a phenomenal course. I always joked with Tino, I'm like, are you sure I'm supposed to be in this course? But no, it was phenomenal. I would say overall, in summary, it honed my thinking in a way beyond what I would have expected. And, just some of the other key things like, Ike talked about with the theories and, the perspective taking, understand historical mindedness, and then, like we said, the IF contribution was great. We had 4 stellar international fellows in our course. And they brought so much to the table, as did everyone else, because I think what the CSP faculty did is they did bring a very diverse set of mindsets and thoughts. Everyone from PhDs on systems analysis to, Pam being an engineer. So it was really, really helpful for me. And what I really liked about the CSP was the way they conceptually framed the course. And so as I talked to my fellow students, they would always be like, oh, that's awesome. That's a great idea. So just for example, in the normal course, you study Thucydides up front. We put it at the very end. So we studied all these theories on war and strategy and policy. We had Tom Galvin coming in there and teach us leadership and management. And then Chris Hickey came in and talked about military campaigning. And then we studied Thucydides. And it made so much sense because now I could apply these theories. I could look at our current joint operating concepts. I could look at what our international fellows are doing in NATO. And then I could see it from thousands of years ago, the same things were happening. And it just blew my mind. And so I was talking with a classmate. He's like, man, I wish I'd taken that at the end. So not only do I think the personnel inside CSP, but I think the way in which it's taught is so powerful.
This is really good. So shout out to Tino Perez, my colleague who manages that. I will say, full disclosure, right? I'm the course director for Theories of War and Strategy. Unfortunately, that is responsible for us doing Thucydides first, which does have its both its pluses and its minuses. But I'll grant that the way Tino decides to do it is definitely different and has its advantages. But one way or another, right, you cannot escape the War College without engaging with Thucydides. So I'm glad that y'all managed to do that. But and so remind me again. So Pam, I know that you're going off to New York for the Corps of Engineers in New York. Ike, where are you going after the War College?
All right, from here I'll be going to Iraq, work at the Baghdad Embassy, doing security cooperations there.
Golly,
so that's going to be I get these suits that I bought. I can wear them.
You can wear them there too. You won't have to wear a uniform. It'll be a whole new world, right?
Yes, sir.
It's good that we gave you all that practice here at Carlisle. That's good. Rick, how about you?
Ike looks good in a suit. So he's going to be great. So I'm going to European Command.
Oh, you are? Okay.
I think right now I'm going to be the J-33, but once you get to it, it will all decide. But yeah, really excited about taking the family to Stuttgart and then working at that senior level.
Outstanding. Well, I'm wishing all of you the best of luck. Thank you for your hard work here. As we're recording this, we're just a couple of weeks away from graduation, so I don't want to jinx anything, but I feel pretty good about all of your chances to complete your degree program here at the War College. But I want to thank Isaac Henderson, Pamela Lovasz, and Rick Luce for joining us today on A Better Peace and talking about your work. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron. It's been great.
And thanks to all of you for listening in. Please send us your comments on this program and all the programs. Send us your suggestions for future programs. We are always interested in hearing from you because we're always interested in broadening this community. Please, now that you've listened to this kind of conversation and your mind has been broadened, take a moment. And if you have not to this point, please subscribe to A Better Peace on your podcatcher of choice. And after you have subscribed, please take a moment to rate and review this podcast, because that's how more people can find out about us so that we can continue to grow the community for conversations like this one. And even though this conversation is over, we look forward to welcoming you to the next one. And so until next time, from the War Room, I'm Ron Granieri.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.